Yeah, I'm put an extra piece of tape on it because it's not the strongest tape.
Do you want to write push?
This is my life. Always. No, I'm wearing.
So welcome everyone to the launch of Satanic Panic. So this is sadly the final day of our show with Catalina Schliebener Munoz of Satanic Panic, but it is a happy day because this book is real. It's in my hands and y'all can buy it, and you should. It's a beautiful book and it includes photos of this exhibition, so that's exciting. It will live on into the future. So welcome to the Bureau of General Services Queer Division. My name is Greg Newton. My partner is Donnie Jokum. We have our volunteer Bree helping out at the back. Thank you. The Bureau is, of course, a government agency for a government that does not yet exist. And thank you. And this is the primary service that we provide, holding this space for queer culture. So we have regular bookstore hours Wednesdays through Sundays from 1 to 7, and then we stay open late whenever we have an event. And we have quite a few coming up. So if you're not already on our email list, you can sign up for that at the back of the room, and you'll get an email every other Monday about those many upcoming events. We are an all-volunteer organization, so we depend on sales and donations. So we do have a suggested donation of $10 for today. I'm going to pass this around, and there's change in it. You can also Venmo us at BGSQD, which is all around you, so you can't screw up those letters. And if money is tight and you want to buy a book, for example, Satanic Panic, you should hold on to your money and buy a book. So those are the many ways that we take your support. I'm going to read a brief land acknowledgement before we get started, and then I will introduce this ever so briefly. So the Bureau acknowledges that our organization operates on unceded land of the Munsee Lenape. We are actively seeking to partner with and provide material support to a local queer Indigenous organization. And we hope to make an announcement about this partnership in the near future. But in the meantime, we encourage you to join the Bureau in signing up to make a monthly donation to the American Indian Community Houses Mannahatta Fund. The Mannahatta Fund, according to its website, is an invitation to all settlers and non-Native people who wish to acknowledge the legacy of the theft and genocide that comprise the history of New York City and the United States. And you can find out more at mannahattafund.org. So I'm giving the very brief versions of our panelists' bios today, so you can read their lengthy list of accomplishments on our website. But for now, suffice it to say that Abram Finkelstein is a founding member of the Silent People of Death and Grand Fury collectives, and one of my personal heroes. And Kata Schliebener Munoz is also one of my personal heroes. Heroes Day. Catalina Schliebener Munoz is a Sud-American Chilean-born visual artist who works primarily with collage, installation, and murals. Their work draws on images, objects, and narratives associated with childhood and explores gender, sexuality, and class. Please welcome Kata and Abram.
So neither of us fully prepared for this because we thought we have a lot to talk about, and we've known each other, worked with each other for a really long time. But I do have a few questions just in case it all goes blank. But I wanted to say that if you don't know about this store, this bookstore, you need to. there used to be several queer bookstores in New York. They all lost their leases and closed. And I think it's one of the smartest things the community center did was to situate the Bureau here. And please don't become a government organization. I might be just the way you
The government doesn't exist yet, so I'm, you know.
Well, the government of the queer nation.
Yeah, that's what I'm not gonna watch there.
No, not that. Yeah. All right, I've already stepped in it. So because we know each other so well, I thought I should ask you some situating questions, but we're quickly going to break into gossip. And you all have something to say, please don't be shy.
Yes.
So for those of you who aren't as old as I am, you may not know that during the rise of the religious right in America in the 80s, there was this boycott of Disney's Little Mermaid because the claim was the images were sexually provocative. And here we are in the 21st century with the exact same things happening. But the situation of the Satanic Panic has been going on for decades, and I think that's what makes Kata's work so compelling and relevant, but also the strategies, the aesthetic strategies behind it. And because we've worked on a couple of exhibitions together, every single installation that Kata does is a year's long project. And a lot of thought goes into it. So I wanted to start by putting your feet to the fire and having you talk a little bit about the Satanic Panic, but in particular, if you could map the meaning of this cultural reaction from the 80s in America and how it played out for you when you were growing up and not in North America.
No. Well, that's a really, I don't even know how to start, but we'll see. Well, I born in 1980 in South America, in Chile, under a dictatorship who started in 1973. So I will say that that's the starting point. That dictatorship was pretty well informed by the US, maybe like sponsored by the US in many ways. So, and it was pretty different in each country in South America. I think Argentina, Brazil, the other, neighbors, like each dictatorship have their own nuances. But the particularly thing about Chile maybe is like, we were consuming a lot of North American culture, or at least that's my memory. I grew up in 3 generations of like lefty family, so I wasn't allowed to watch TV, and of course not Disney. So maybe that's how everything started. So what was the question again?
How you became aware of it, because it's sort of, you were a little kid when it was growing in the US.
Yeah.
Did you find this subject matter through research? Or?
No, not at all. I was a kid. So in the late 80s and the beginning of the 90s, we were like entering the democratic process, we put it that way. In 89, we finally have like plebiscito. How do you say plebiscito? Somebody can translate that? I don't know. Anyway, vote to come back to democracy. Referendum. There we go. So there was a really intense referendum, and in 89 we started the process of coming back to democracy. Of course, this didn't happen from one day to another. There were a lot of things going on until mid-90s, I would say. And in the beginning of the 90s, when I was like 11 or something, we have our own kind of expression, like our own version of Satanic Panic. Well, first of all, Satanic Panic is like kind of a cultural phenomenon who started here in the US. And I'm not going to do the Wikipedia thing because you can Google it.
Research.
So it started in the 80s here, and I have many different moments, but particularly in my hometown, around 1990, 1991, some of that, like late legacy of Satanic Panic started to come, and it started, at least in Chile, with this Brazilian show that we had for kids called Xuxa. You can read about it in the book. It's like whoever comes from South America, like, know that show. Like, we grew up like watching the show, and the anecdote is great because it started in like in a small radio station in Antofagasta, in Chile. The person who was running the program was like, I think the cassette tape got stopped or something, like something happened, and he listened this like hidden messages saying like Satan. It's magnificent. But that's how everything started. So Xuxa was accused of being satanic and all this. That's how it started for me. I was doing the same thing with the cassette tape, like, and then a few years later, I was like maybe 10 or 11 back then. And around 14, I was really into metal, like not even heavy metal because that was the 80s. So I was into like death metal, really intense death metal. And that's when I was like, oh, and also coming out as queer, like, so that weird mix of like metal, extreme, masculine, full of testosterone energy, and coming out as queer. So that mix also was really strange. I switched a few years after that. I was like goth and super emo. So like that's a short bit. But enough to be super paranoid, like about like Satan or the metaphor.
It's hilarious to hear you talking about it because the exact everything you just named was happening here. The backwards recordings, the rise of speed metal, and I mean, but I think it's so weird to think that we were still in that moment, or in that moment once again. It's like this idea has never gone away and has probably existed centuries before we were around, but the frame of reference in this work, I think, is so, it's so specific to you, because even though it's largely Disney cartoon imagery that you're dealing with, but also other children's books like, it's not
Dick
really
and
Dick and,
Jane.
it is Dick and Jane? Okay.
Yeah, Dick and Jane, and this series called Lady Bird. Like, so it's books, like educational books, basically. So the mix of books that I'm using for this series is like Disney, and particularly book edit in the 90s. Like, I have one of those, I think the Little Mermaid one. And then, I started to collect them. Like, usually I found a book and then I buy many copies on eBay. That's how they come from, basically.
Tata's like just a tiny bit obsessive. So if there's one of anything, there are thousands. I think it's super interesting when we were working on the Satanic Panic installation for a show I curated with Kata in it. That when we were mounting that installation, the background was all of those collages, paper that was actually cut out from books and mounted on the wall. Again, just a tiny bit obsessive compulsive. But as we were working on it, I remember you pointing out that, or drawing attention to, that all of the images in the background were from Little Mermaid and Pinocchio, and that they were not human. They were inanimate objects, they were puppets, they were monsters, they were sea animals, and that the work that hung on top of it, which was, were those actually in the show, or these?
The same series,
Yeah.
I made 5 of them.
And those collages were hanging on that backdrop. And those collages had all the human children in them. But what I never said to you, and I've been thinking about for a long time, was the fact that you collaged the humans into monstrosities. I mean, they're imaginary ideas of what childhood is like. So the two are so related, but there's foundationally so different.
Yeah.
Do you think that everything about all representations of the body are either abstractions or hint at some form of monstrosity?
Oh, that's a good one. Okay, I have to talk a little bit about the process.
Okay.
Okay. So basically for this series, most of the backgrounds are these Disney books. And in particular for the Satanic Panic, I choose Pinocchio, Little Mermaid, and Beauty and the Beast, because I was interested in how in each of those stories, the main character was like fighting to be human. And it was 3 different stages of life, like a kid in Pinocchio, a teenager in Little Mermaid, and a young grown-up in Beauty and the Beast. And how like basically they insist on being human, and the whole drama is basically that, like we can be human. So I was like, that first was kind of a great metaphor of queerness too. It's like, yeah, again, I always start a series with a prompt, and that prompt is like, I don't pretend to illustrate that prompt directly, just play with it. It's just like a way of starting.
It's a rabbit hole.
Yeah, it's a rabbit hole.
It's a rabbit hole.
Yeah. So basically, back to the question. Yeah, so the collage, so each element in the collage have a different function. So Disney is kind of like backgrounds, and then these human characters coming from these pedagogical books are, yeah, the characters in this interacting with this background. But sometimes, and most of the time, they confuse and they, interact, and some aspect of the monsters in the background started to be part of the kids' bodies. And yeah, and I was thinking, I mean, my whole work, I guess, is about mass culture, image culture, whatever you want to call it, and childhood. And I grew up with all the images and the kind of books that, I use for my collages. Many people are like, oh, but they're so vintage. Yeah, for some reason I have these books when I was a kid. I never saw myself represented in those books or movies. So
yeah.
Now that I'm getting older, I'm understanding too that it's like, it has, of course, biographical aspect, but yeah, but it has a lot to do with like not seeing yourself and trying to mess up with these elements, and yeah, like take them and do something with it.
I had originally conceived of it it was in a show called Omniscient Queer Documentation in an Image Culture. Sorry, it's 2 years ago. There was a pandemic in between. So I felt like it was really relevant, but I was thinking of it in terms of, I've been thinking a lot about corporeality and all of the feminist critiques of health and science and medicine and identity, and they're so foundational to my life growing up. We weren't allowed to, I did watch The Wonderful World of Color on Sunday nights, but we all knew that Disney was fucked up. But I was really thinking of this work in relation to the question of transition.
Mm-hmm.
So as we're working on it, I'm looking at all these images and hearing you talk about it that way, it sort of began to open up for me in ways that I hadn't actually conceptualized.
Mm-hmm.
Because I do think about corporeality and questions of access and questions of identity are so integral to the way politics are constructed, especially after the 19th century, and definitely in the 21st century.
Mm.
It was very surprising to me to hear you pinpoint this whole other set of questions, some of which are personal, but when you use the word monsters, it surprised me.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something you think about?
Yes. I mean, yes, and in really problematic ways, I think about it. And also, like, I know, I was like listening what you were saying. Many of these things that I'm like I find when I'm working. So it's not that I have a statement before, what I mean? Like, why am I drawn to this image, to these characters in particular, or to these stories? And like, those like links started to happen with the work. So in particular in this series, I think I was interested in that concept of like the freak or the monster related to queerness in a way, and like, or like the non-human, let's put it that way. Yeah.
I mean, it is a queer dilemma. It's why people complained about the Little Mermaid, but there was some conversation about a camel cigarette ad because the cartoon of the camel, the snout looked phallic, and so that got swept into it too. But it didn't matter as much in a way because it was something that an adolescent who was beginning to, this is my interpretation at the time, an adolescent is beginning to evolve into adulthood, and smoking isn't as horrifying as childhood sexuality. It's like that is just, we were trained to think that children are not sexual, but anyone who's ever worked with children knows that that's really not true. Children are very sexual, but we're not supposed to talk about it.
Yeah. Yes. So yeah, all those things are things that are in my practice. I'm happen to be an educator at the same time and work with little kids. So this is something that we've been talking a lot. So basically, yeah, like the idea was like to play with those concepts too and bring sexuality and like children's sexuality really like, not in a explicit way because children's sexuality is not a grown-up sexuality. So that's also objects are extension of the body. Like, and again, when I started to explore all this concept, like I realized how many overlaps with queerness I was finding too, no? And yeah, like the idea of the Satanic Panic too is like, I remember like being like a, preteen, and all these concerns were about like, yeah, like this body that doesn't fit so well and it doesn't conform, and like somehow that was the satanic aspect of it. I don't know if that makes sense, but it was
No, it kind of does. I mean, it's a scrim. Your practice is a scrim through which we find out about you, but also you discover things about yourself. Because one of the things I've learned from working with you is that the work evolves. You've already said this. It never is a concept, and it starts out in one way and it stays there. It's something that changes. Which is why I was thinking so much about transformation when I saw this piece. But I think it goes much deeper.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about transformation? Keep talking.
Yeah, let's talk about transformation. Because we were hinting at it and talking about it already, but I think so most of the work that I'm known for as an artist is in public spaces, but as I become increasingly disabled, I've come to think of public spaces as not intrinsically more accessible because they're public. I used to think the fact that it's not a white cube is like got everything going for it. But now I think that the ways in which shared space is activated is actually a much more accurate metric for access. I know that we talk a lot about our bodies, and I think that it really informs your work. And I think that's kind of what I was hinting at with the monster question.
Yeah, I'm like trying to dig in all the conversations that we're having, like yeah, pretty much when I'm exploring, I think childhood also, I'm exploring that moment of our life that is like embedded with like transforming, like your body's changing, like your mind is changing, like your body's growing way faster than you expect, like you feel a little bit like that, like a little bit that monstrosity somehow, and yeah, and it's interesting because every time that we have our conversations, we started to discover together how our practice is in form of like things that are happening in our bodies, even though at the beginning I was like, nah, not really. But but part of the conversation that we're having, like we're in together somehow.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that in a way we're growing up together. Like, childhood is a remote idea, we both have pasts and we both have childhoods, but we're here in the 21st century. And I think all of the things about your work, we touched on this when it was getting really hairy about education and
Yes.
sexuality and identity. And now you're at the Queen's Museum and do you want to talk a little bit about that, but also talk about what it's like to be a queer person in this time and space?
Well, again, coming back at how this series even started. This series started as a joke with my ex-partner. I was like, in the beginning of Trump era, I was like, oh, this feels really similar to, you know, when I was a kid growing up in Chile in the 80s, like this kind of moral paranoia. I was also like already working like for 3 years as an early childhood educator. And I was like, oh, yes, like now that I'm around kids, like I started as a research almost, like I working like around childhood. So I need to work around kids and like observe them and research like pretty in proximity. And I have a few situations in school where like, yeah, I was kind of, I don't even want to dig in there because I'm gonna cry. So anyway, but insinuating like really fucked up things from another teacher. And in that setting also around the same time, I was getting involved with a team of early childhood educators in CUNY. One of my colleagues are here. And we were creating programs to early childhood educators about gender and sexuality in early childhood education. So all those things started to inform, you know, this body of work. And for the first time, I felt that many aspects of my life were coming together, like my visual art practice, my day job in the school. And yeah, I studied philosophy many years ago. And and queer theory somehow were all, you know, coming together. And again, all those aspects of my life inform the practice, but indirectly or in an oblique way. So yeah, all that to say that, again, I'm getting lost here.
I was asking you to probe what it's like in the 21st century to be working with children as a queer person. It's basically what I was.
Yeah, it's tricky though.
It's tricky. But when you made the comment about monstrosity, when we were doing that installation that this exhibition is partly based on, I was thinking about Donna Haraway and like all of those questions about corporeality that are more theoretical, but also ingenious and inventive and forward thinking, and the world pretty much knows nothing about unless you travel in the circles that we travel in. And that's so distinctly different from actually having children in the room with you and having to address the tension surrounding sexuality and identity in that context.
I mean, when you're a visual queer person, visible queer person in a room. Sorry, I spent 10 days in Argentina speaking Spanish. Which in English is really hard. Anyway, when you're a visible queer person working with kids, a lot of things happen. First of all, the kids, the first or second day of school ask you, are you a boy or a girl? And sometimes you don't know how to, I mean, I have an answer for that, but maybe, and kids completely get it, but the other
What's
teacher,
the answer?
I'm neither. And they're like, oh, okay. And then it's like, or another teacher was like, what happened? They're 3 years old, they're also figuring out the same thing, you know? So it's like, that's how it looks like. So you get along pretty well. The problem are the other grown-ups.
Is the context.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember there was a show that maybe you can see online in the 80s called the Pee Wee Herman Show. And so completely diabolical in terms of sexuality. It was just packed with queer characters, references, and sexual references. And somehow it just, because it was kitschy, I don't know why it got a free pass until his career fell apart. But I think that was about something else.
I mean, he was also Satanic Panic. Remember, he was like found in like a porn theater, and then
That's right. And he was found.
and his whole amazing career.
Break out your Google machines.
Yeah,
I forgot completely about that.
I was such a fan of him.
Everyone was. It's like,
Oh no.
yeah, it was like, while the concept of the show was making money, and I think a lot of that had to do with the same things that are happening now in terms of cultural nostalgia for a better time or a simpler time. All of his gestures in his program reference the 50s and a different idea about what it meant to be a person or what it meant to be an American. But half of the characters in his show were like decapitated head in a box, and like they were puppets, and or they were animals. It was like, it's so I've been thinking a lot about how he got a free pass at that same time that they picked on The Little Mermaid, which all I could think of with The Little Mermaid was like, so what's this story about? You give up your voice or your legs to be loved. Like,
to be loved and to be human also.
To be human, but to be loved by this particular person, which is
But you're still a kid. That's
you're a
really,
kid.
Yeah.
Yeah, and yeah, she's the Little Mermaid.
Yeah.
But it's full of like sexual iconography. Like, her dad is this muscle queen with a big beard, and the monster is based on divine. It's like I could see how we got there, but it's so weird what gets a pass and what doesn't. So I wanted to talk a little bit about this work. So before the Satanic Panic series, Gato has been doing these very large line drawings that are made of cut vinyl, that it's such an insane process. And luckily, your sister is a graphic designer and can help prep all of these files.
Yeah.
But they're based on coloring books. So in a way, it's like the logical precursor to Satanic Panic, which is you get to color inside these lines to decide what they mean. That's the beauty of a coloring book. And so I think that that's foundational to your work. And I love that we're sitting in front of this. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the line work and the coloring book, but also I've noticed that you've lately started mirroring these images, where in the past they were just gigantic murals of fragments of human and animals in combination, or childhood games and human. So talk a little bit about this work and the mirroring and how you got to that.
I think the mirroring started in at the end of 2029 when I started the series. And those are the first of the series, those collages over there. Between 2029 and 2020, so at the beginning of the pandemic, I was like trapped in this to produce like 50 of those.
Yes, I remember that.
Yeah, and I realized how everything started to become more like I was seeking for abstraction somehow. Like I started with these backgrounds, I started with the mirrors, I started with like patterns.
Right.
And I was thinking a lot of something like abstraction, like muddy abstraction somehow.
Well, they became more and more muddy as you explored it.
Yes, and I was at the same time like creating this kind of pop-up books with discarded cutouts from the collages. So that's how it. And I was realizing that I was cutting to create the pop-up books. I was like creating these images, like that game that we used to do with sister when we were kids. That you cut open, just fold it. So that's how the mirror situation started. And
I
then,
hadn't really made that connection. In truth, the installation, Satanic Panic, was supposed to be
oh,
a
yeah.
series of pop-up books. I remember, like, after a year or two of working on it, to find that actually the pop-ups were pasted on the background, and it was a whole other
Yeah.
thing. And I loved the reveal aspect of a pop-up book, and also the ingenuity and the play and the mechanism involved in it. There's something really entrancing about it. And I was kind of crestfallen when you evolved away from it. But hearing you talk about it, I understand.
Yeah, that's how I came back to the mirrors. I realized that like mirror images I've been like working with mirror images like for a while, but they came back somehow in Satanic Panic, and especially like, yeah, this was like a kind of a parallel series, like that I called Coloring Book, that I started many years ago, that I started again revisiting with Satanic Panic, seeking for abstraction somehow, and seeking for like, yeah, this kind of vortex of, you know, mirroring images, but also like thinking also about the, again, monstrosity or excess, or how, yeah, always the coloring book, like it started first at the collages, like in a small scale, and then I started to scan them and expand it to like, and they became murals. But it was like the idea that all these fragments coming from coloring books can be like accessory parts of our bodies, and like how, yeah, like extensions of the body or prosthetics.
Yeah, we talked a lot about prosthetics over the years.
Yes.
And I think that that's also about transition as well, like for, you know, the electronic prosthetic, like all of the various ideas about gender that have to do with transition.
Yeah.
But you can't ignore the fact that mirroring is about seeing yourself also.
Yeah.
It's about abstraction, but it's also about fingering it in a deeper way.
Yeah. Yeah, and also, I mean, I was like thinking about mirrors and thinking about the Rocher test too. Like that's how, like the idea that like the mind always is gonna complete like an abstract image, and like how that is like full of metaphors too. Like, and like I was feeling like the whole time that I've been doing my work, it's like, oh, it's so porn and like. And like, and so it's like the same joke, you know, it's like another Disney cards. Coming back to that, you know, like your mind is completing things too, and I'm just like helping you to complete those things.
Yeah, and potentially helping you to complete them as well, because I think that over the years I've noticed a difference in not just your practice, but your personhood, your selfhood, and so in a way the mirroring, which it's true, it's been around for a while, but they're so apparent in the line work version of it.
Yes.
So I wanted to leave time for questions, but I want to ask you one more. I want to hold your feet to the fire on one more thing. So one of the things that I love about this work is the monumental scale of it, as opposed to a book, which is something you hold in your hand and can be contained, and it's an object and it's precious. And this is overwhelming. I mean, the power differential between the viewer and work of this scale really changes the meaning of it. Transferring that onto your sculpture. So if you don't know Kata's sculpture, you're going to have to buy this book, because the sculptures are amazing.
I mean, you call them sculpture, I call them just like objects.
Right, they're dismembered collage toys, basically. They're so, I'm going to use the word diabolical for the second a conversation about Satan. But I think that work, gigantic, would those tiny toy-like, again, you escape the preciousness and they become overpowering. They become monstrous.
Yeah.
Have you thought about changing the scale of that work?
Yeah, and you've been insisting a lot. So
No, I mean, it's just, We will
We'll
just,
do it.
we will scan it. We'll just do a digital scan and then we will cast it in plastic and we can make any size. It's really simple to do. And we will be doing that.
I mean, we're being directing, like a machine will be. And we'll be doing like more to the right.
That's the other thing. It's like, I feel it's necessary to point out, since you were referred to as heroic, the act of heroism of all of that cut work that goes into these collages.
Yes. There's a lot
Yeah.
of-
There's such a high level of craft to the work that I think gets lost in the complexity of it, or the layeredness of its meaning in terms of gender and identity. Do we have any questions? Are we adhering to the 1 hour thing? Okay, I just glanced at my phone. Yes.
I just wanted to make a comment in terms of I'm thinking about your monsters in terms of the historical like notion of grotesque in like say monsters that are like kind of guardians in different religions. So there's like sort of that spiritual element of like this sort of fear, like concept of a monster or grotesque that also has this. These are kind of deterrents, but pathways at the same time, and you are able to sort of overcome a fear, you know. And so that I wanted to make that connection with the grotesque. And also this notion of play and paranoia, where in sort of capitalistic modified societies, you have this notion to be playful in parameters. And once they come out of those parameters, then that leakage becomes, you know, sort of transgressive. So then paranoia is within sort of those systems can only play within commodified parameters. Once it becomes sort of starts leaking out, then notions of paranoia set in. It's not a controlled kind of pressure.
Yeah.
You know, like pressure becomes uncontrolled and becomes set in relational to paranoid fear to the grotesque and sort of pleasure is very interesting.
Thank you so much for that comment. Like, there's so many things.
That is the smartest thing I've heard.
Yes. Let's write it down.
This is your new essay.
But also, like, yeah, I mean, exactly all those concepts. I was like working in the Satanic Panic. They're not here, but like there's a whole series with like the one that Abram is referring, like little figurines that from this collection from the 80s called. Some of them are Precious Moment, but this collection was a different one with like tender little kids. Like they're all really also kind of has like a neurotic component that is really problematic because they're meant for grown-ups also. So that's anyway. So I was like using some monster characters for like Monster Inc. like specifically for that series, like toys, and like working specifically in that tension of like tenderness and like almost like you don't know if the characters are gonna be hug or attack. Like I was really interested in that tension. So yes, all the things that you said is an amazing comment.
And I think also I've been thinking so much about Jewish folklore and any mythology that's based in stories that are handed down. And even though it's the 21st century and people know enough about queers to have laws written against them still, much of how we think about ourselves is handed down to us. I was having a conversation last night at dinner with some friends from my affinity group in ACT UP, and we were talking about Trump in relation to the rise of the right wing as being relating directly to social media, and she was like, no, like the lesbian Avengers would say something one week and then we'd be in another city and they would be repeating that chant there. We didn't have pocket computers. It's the way in which ideas move through culture. But I think it also like I love this gesture about the Rorschach test and psychology, and the ways in which those things relate to identity, like
Yeah.
the obliteration and the move away from Joseph Campbell and Carl Jung into this kind of queer counter narrative about metaphysics and as they relate to identity. And I think that's, you've named something in Kata's work that I forgot to write about. That was brilliant.
Next one.
Another question
Or comments.
or comments? Yeah. Well, you know the answer to that.
I don't know. Well, I'm a fellow at the Queen's Museum, and I'm having a show there in 2024. And I'm going the Mattress Factory at the beginning of next year too. So I'm really looking forward to kind of wrap up with this series and start a new one that is also based in Disney and two really fucked up movies made in the 40s about Latin America.
You were talking about that, and I didn't want to bring it up because I didn't want to blow up that concept,
Oh, no,
but
that's-
please talk about it because I think it's super interesting.
Yeah, also it's kind of a joke about like how when you're a queer brown Latinx artist, you have to work about that. And my work, of course, is about that, but in a really oblique way. So it's like, okay, so in like the market and there's something about the moment that we're right now that everything is so focused in our identities all the time. And so I'm so tired. But I was like, okay, this is work about
Well, it was, can I talk about the cartoons? So in particular, it's a series of Disney cartoons that are pre-colonial, not pre-colonial, but that are colonialist treatises, which is another forgotten aspect of what Disney did.
Yeah. Okay, let me tell a little bit about it. So it's like
Yeah.
a teaser.
Yeah.
So you know what's gonna happen in
Yeah,
2024
give us
and
a
they make it
teaser.
like. So yeah, in 1939, the US government asked Disney in person to go back to South America to create this amazing 2 movies about Latin America called Los Tres Caballeros, the 3 Caballeros, or Saludos Amigos, greeting friends. And it was part of this whole government plan of like creating economic exchange with South America, but also started to create the image of what we are for Americans, no? So this is a mix of exotism and like, so they go back to Chile, Peru, Brazil, Argentina, and yeah, the depiction of the people who live there are like you can imagine, mixed with like a musical, and they're amazing. Like I highly recommend it. Recently I signed for like a Disney Channel because I started to watch all these films again, and now all these films have like a warning.
So sorry.
That
They
this-
wanted to?
Yes, Disney
What did they say?
It's same story.
This man. This apologize.
So I don't even know what I'm gonna do because it's Disney
Oh, you
already
have
saying
to, that
sorry.
has to be.
I'm concerned now. I was like, "God, they're already saying sorry." Well, because they catch up depictions of like me.
You'll figure out how
Yeah.
to needle them further about it. So,
So that's what is coming. The name of the project is Good Neighbors.
I was also raised generations of lefties, and for some reason, my brother became obsessed with the TV show that was on right after The Wonderful World of Color, which is called The FBI. And so he was sort of obsessed about it, but because my father had worked with Ethel Rosenberg and they used to hand out copies of the Daily Worker, she had this idea that, my mother had this idea, to buy him a book on the FBI based on the television show. So if they came for them, they couldn't accuse them of having indoctrinated us. P.S. My brother gave me a copy of Mao's Red Book when I went into middle school, so it's not like he was indoctrinated.
That's what happened when you grow up in those kind of families.
Yeah, you learn the meaning of what you're told. Any more observations? Yeah.
I guess just connected to that, to make the bridge to like the fact that you being somewhere like the King's Museum, that was also the kind of cultural policy, part of how Roma developed with their international program, it's still run. It was through the good neighbor policy, having funding for curators to go to Latin America and see artists. And a lot of the early modern graphics and some were actually Latin American artists. You can see it over there. But it was this kind of method of reducing the threat of communism through cultural work. So Queen's Museum being the site of the World's Fair is very much a part of that conversation.
Yes, that's why the whole project was meant for that space.
Oh, they're gonna be so annoyed with you.
I mean, I have two people from Queen's Museum here. I'm not gonna push it out.
Shit, sorry. We love the Queen's Museum. Well, there was also that Tanya Bergara project at the Queen's Museum. I mean, this has been the turf for a long time.
Yeah.
You're the smartest people in the world. We should co-curate with everyone in the on the curatorial collector.
I like that idea.
Any
It's the
more
first
observations that are gonna startle and inspire us? Don't stop now, you're so
No,
smart.
but also I have to say something that all these ideas also happen when I'm having conversations with people. Like I
Yes.
have to say that, like, yeah, all the good neighbors policy thing and this movie started as a conversation with my friend Nico back in Argentina. So it's like all these comments are actually like.
Yeah, I mean, the thing they don't tell us as teachers is that teaching is actually learning. Like there's this whole hierarchy about what we're supposed to be there to do,
Yeah.
but every time someone opens their mouth in a public place, in a classroom, on a subway, it's like
Yeah.
you're taking.
But also, I
notes.
think that's the great thing of working with things that already exist and like characters that are, like all of us know for some reason. And like before we even know that we know them, it's like, oh, yeah, they don't look like me, but I know them somehow.
Yeah.
It's kind of, that's why I'm so drawn to those images.
Yes.
Are there any other movies that we should watch before next year?
There's a ton of them. Let's talk about friends.
Oh, Sign for Disney Channel is like a horror film. Don't put your kids watching those things.
That's
Yeah,
good advice.
there's a lot of like, don't do that, like, don't do that.
So that's the
Definitely.
parental warning that you will set is your children can't watch Disney. You
Yes.
can. Is there another question?
I guess more looking at like, have you thought about, or I don't know if you're already like incorporating also movies like Coco and Encanto and that sort of thing that seem to be from the same sort of like dialogue of like here is Latin America, but at the same time I'm sure that it's coming in from another
Yeah.
place, not that it's trying to be more aware,
Inclusive, aware, all those things.
things.
That's a great question. No, but why? Because I usually like a lot of the work that I do is to try to access some of the memories that I have when I was a kid. So I use things that I used to consume because I knew them there. And now I'm trying to revisit some of those aspects. But I'm really interested in those. I have so much expectation about Coco and all that, and it's like no, Encanto is terrible. Like it's like this, like it seems that it's Colombia, but it's just like in this weird place that it's like a magical, so Latin America is this kind of magical place in the middle of the forest that seems like Colombia, but not really. Like it's a mix of many countries, so North American people can understand, and it's like it doesn't exist actually. It's like in somebody's, it's like a vortex. We are vortex, so it's like I have many expectations maybe.
It's like the lie of the American mind that we think we understand the world when we know nothing about it. Something you said earlier about the cartoons, the Disney cartoons, that was during a moment when performers like Ima Sumac became this international rage. She was from Queens, but she was billed as a Aztec princess or something like that. I can't really remember what the storyline was, but it was a complete fabrication about the meaning of indigenous life and a blurring of those lines. And I think one of the things I learned when I was curating the show before Omniscient was how distinctly different all of the Latinx artists were from all over South America. They were so complete, had such a completely distinct worldview. And in fact, recently had an argument with a Latino artist and a Latino curator who were arguing about the word Latinx, the idea of identity being instantly compacted into one thing as opposed to many things, which is, I think, what queerness should be about. I think that we're told to do that with queerness too. Certain types of queerness are privileged, and that changes in time as to what's privileged and what we're told to, what we're meant to think about it. But we know how different we are from our former selves and from each other.
Yeah.
Right? Which is what I love about you. Any other? You're all filling me with ideas, so don't stop now.
Kata, have you researched the Golden Book series?
Yes, I have so many of those.
Okay, just checking, this is a project. They expand on the original stories, starting offshoots of, in the books for kids. So,
Yeah,
you know,
I love
they
the
have
idea of
something-
like the Golden Book, but because also like the cheap versions of like many other collections, so they have everything.
Yeah.
And there still exists, and they're being in print forever.
Yeah. Okay,
Yes.
just curious.
Any other curatorial suggestions? They're a sponge, so don't be afraid. Is there anything else you wanted to close out with? That we didn't
No,
touch on?
like just say thank you everybody for being here. Every time that I like do one of these things of talking, I'm like, I don't know if I say even something that touch what I've been doing. Like all the time I have that feeling. It happened in Spanish too, so I can pretend that it's like English thing.
No, it's you. You have to buy this book. It's so startling. It's small. You can fit it.
It's
in the
small, you can
pocket.
fit it in your pocket. That's the other thing, like.
All right, thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
We have
everyone.
the book, it's at the counter.